Sego sewakwego, kahantagi ni yungyuts, ganyake haga nii waskuleuge. Hello everyone, greetings. My name is Gahantage, which in Ganyakeha, or the Mohawk language, means she is in the meadow. But for the purposes of this learning module, you can call me Heather. I am Mohawk and Bear Clan from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory, and we welcome you to this learning experience on land acknowledgements in Turtle Island. It is important to understand the long-standing history that has brought you to reside on the land, and to seek to understand your place within that history. Land acknowledgements do not exist in a past tense or historical context. We must understand that colonialism is a current, ongoing process and not a timestamp in history.
I'm very honored and privileged to be here with you all today to share a bit about my learning journey so far regarding land acknowledgements. I want to first say a big Nyawagoa Miigwech thank you to the Canadian Race Relations Foundation for working with First Peoples Group to bring this content forward, these really, really important conversations about anti-Indigenous racism, about reconciliation, about decolonization, and we are really, really so honored to be involved with you all doing this really important work and kicking off this web series today. And there will be a series. There will be multiple videos wherein we are discussing different topics related to anti-Indigenous racism, as well as how we are called into action regarding reconciliation. So Nyawagoa Miigwech, thank you to you all for tuning into this video, for clicking watch. We really hope that there are some great tidbits in here where you can learn about the purposes of land acknowledgements, learn a little bit about some Indigenous knowledge as it relates to a worldview of land, as well as some practical ways you can implement land acknowledgements in your own personal and professional lives as well. The layout for today, we are going to start with some context setting of what are land acknowledgements. We're going to spend some time talking about the past, talking about pre-contact. The story of Sky Woman is one story which I will offer today in terms of a framing as it relates to Indigenous worldview of land. And that story is coming from my people, the Haudenosaunee. We will talk a little bit about treaties today as well. Next, we will move into developing a land acknowledgement. And during this portion of the webinar, we will talk about some considerations as well as process. Now, we are not going to offer necessarily a prescriptive template where you can just kind of insert your own information there, as we are really trying to communicate that land acknowledgements should be meaningful, they should be personal. And so we will offer some questions to think about in terms of process, how you develop a land acknowledgement, as well as some considerations in terms of what's really important to think about when constructing that land acknowledgement. Last, we will move into and kind of leave you all to do some work yourselves and provide some resources so that you're able to practice some of these tools yourself on your own time. Before we jump into the content specifically related to land acknowledgements, we'd like to take some time to frame reconciliation. Reconciliation is a term, is a practice, is a commitment that is being used so widely across Canada right now. And we know that for some folks, it's kind of a question mark, right? What does that mean? What does reconciliation mean? How am I involved in reconciliation? And what is my place within it all? We really like to frame that reconciliation is not only about person-to-person relations, right? Reconciliation is about a commitment to relationship. And when we're talking about a commitment to relationship, it's about a relationship with yourself, a relationship with other human beings, a relationship with the land, and a relationship with other beings as well. Right? In that, we could talk about plant beings, we could talk about other animals, we could talk about waters as well. Right? And when we're talking about that commitment to relationship, two things that we should always really try and hold to are, what are these opportunities where we can come together, where we can harmonize, where we can say, you know what, we are more alike than we are different, right? I may come from this faith or spiritual background, you may come from this faith or spiritual background, but what are those crossover and connection points between the two? It's also really important to hold on to those possible points of tension, right? We know that coming from different walks of life, different worldviews, different orientation points, that there will be moments where we realize, well, hey, we just don't see eye to eye on this, right? And what is the root of that? Where does that come from, right? And acknowledging that two things can be true at the same time, I think is something that's really so key and so important, that there can be multiple truths and not necessarily one universal truth out there. Okay. So when looking at reconciliation specifically with self, something that's really important is to take a moment to really reflect on yourself and your own identities, right? Think about, who am I as a person? What makes up my identities, right? And that may include things such as your family dynamic, your age, your faith, your race, your ability, your sexual orientation, your first language, etc. Right? And think about, how do those different identities shape the way in which I walk through the world? Those are really important considerations and reflections that we need to have in terms of moving from just being reflective to reflexive, right? Being reflexive is all about, how do we change? How do we move differently? How do we take new information and kind of embed that into the way that we're going to conduct ourselves as humans, right? In this process of being committed to a relationship with self, we also really need to acknowledge that we may hold biases, right? Based on our learning experiences, based on our life experiences, right? And really acknowledge, what are those things that I have learned, right? Where did they come from? What are they rooted in, right? Is there some unlearning that needs to take place? Is there some relearning that needs to take place? Are there some moments where I need to really just sit back and listen and connect with others? Right? So that's moving us into kind of our second bullet here, which is reconciliation being about a commitment to relationship with others, with other humans. Okay. And I spoke of before those opportunities to harmonize and possible points of tension. And I think something that's really important to recognize and realize here is that, yes, we are coming from different contexts, different walks of life. And while someone kind of on paper may have very similar identities to yourself, that doesn't mean that their orientation to the world is completely similar to yours. I really invite folks to step outside their comfort zone, to connect with people who may come from different walks of life, right? And not only fall into kind of that comfort of being with folks who may really confirm your biases, right? How do we step outside and really broaden our scope of what it means to exist here in Canada or in Turtle Island? Next bullet is about reconciliation in terms of our relationship with the land. And I think that's something that's so important here. One is to understand from an Indigenous context. And when I say Indigenous, I use that as a plural because there is so much diversity across Indigenous communities and nations throughout Canada. It's really important to understand, what is the worldview in terms of how land is seen, how land is valued from an Indigenous perspective here on these lands? And why that's so important is because what you will find, and we'll talk a little bit about this later, is that it goes far beyond land as a resource for development. It goes far beyond land as a resource for recreation, right? And so it's really, really important to understand that both historical and contemporary worldview from an Indigenous lens on land, and also really think about your own interactions with land, right? How are you caretaking? How are you acting as a steward for land? How are you in relationship with land as well, right? And then lastly, other beings, right? So this could include, but certainly not limited to, other plant beings, animals, the waters as well, in terms of what does our reconciliatory relationship look like? What is our impact? How are we giving back? How are we giving thanks? How are we in relationship with those other beings? One other thing I would like to mention in terms of framing reconciliation is this dynamic between truth and reconciliation. I think oftentimes we are so quick to jump into reconciliation, which is a lot more about action. And what I want to first just state here is that underpinning there in terms of wanting to act, wanting to seek justice is filled with so much positive intent, right? People are learning in real time about the atrocities that so many Indigenous peoples have faced, specifically in relation to residential schools, and are saying, you know, something needs to be done about this. What is the accountability, and how can I be a part of that action? And there's so much positive and well intent there. And I think it's very important for us to understand that our actions need to be reflective of truth that we are gaining. And so we don't see truth and reconciliation as this kind of linear path, but rather a cyclical relationship. When we gain some truth, that should impact our action. And then we kind of sit with that action, right? How was that received by others? How did that feel from myself, you know, engaging in that action? And then maybe I need to adjust. Maybe I need to do some more listening. Maybe I need to do some more unlearning or relearning. And I move back into that truth piece of this cycle. Learn some more, unlearn some more, and then that informs another action. So we see this as a kind of codependent relationship. We're not just moving from truth to reconciliation and then, you know, wiping our hands and saying, call it a day, but rather truth informs reconciliation, and reconciliation will inform truth learning, and so on in that relationship. Now moving into our topic for today, which is land acknowledgements. So first, want to start by providing some context for folks about, well, what are land acknowledgements? As it says on the screen here, land acknowledgements are an honest and historically accurate way to recognize the traditional First Nations, Métis, and/or Inuit territories of a place. Okay? And the reason why land acknowledgements are so necessary is because it is but a very first step toward honoring the original peoples or original occupants of a place. They help us to respect and to recognize Indigenous peoples' inherent kinship beliefs when it comes to the land, especially since those beliefs were restricted for so long. Right? It was actually outlawed at one point in Canadian history for Indigenous peoples to be able to practice ceremony, right? And so by acknowledging the traditional stewards or caretakers of a place, we are acknowledging the histories and the dedication to wanting to learn more about those peoples. Next, we will move into sharing a creation story in an effort to really center Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous worldview of land. Now, this specific story is coming from a Haudenosaunee context, or some folks may know the Haudenosaunee as the Iroquois Confederacy. So in no way is this a story that is representative of all Indigenous nations or communities, but rather one story that we will center here today, and it is the story of Sky Woman. So some folks on the call here today may have heard the term Turtle Island used before. So I'm actually going to read an excerpt from Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer's text, Braiding Sweetgrass, wherein she actually describes this story of Sky Woman, or the creation story. So here we go. She fell like a maple seed, pirouetting on an autumn breeze. A column of light streamed from a hole in the sky world, marking her path where only darkness had been before. It took her a long time to fall. In fear, or maybe hope, a bundle tightly in her hand. Hurtling downward, she saw only dark water below. But in that emptiness, there were many eyes gazing up at the sudden shaft of light. They saw there a small object, a mere dust mote in the beam. As it grew closer, they could see that it was a woman, arms outstretched, long black hair billowing behind as she spiraled toward them. The geese nodded at one another and rose together from the water in a wave of goose music. She felt the beat of their wings as they flew beneath to break her fall. Far from the only home she had ever known, she caught her breath at the warm embrace of soft feathers as they gently carried her downward. And so it began. The geese could not hold the woman above the water for much longer, so they called a council to decide what to do. Resting on their wings, she saw them all gather: loons, otters, swans, beavers, fish of all kinds. A great turtle floated in their midst and offered his back for her to rest upon. Gracefully, she stepped from the goose wings onto the dome of his shell. The others understood that she needed land for her home and discussed how they might serve her need. The deep divers among them had heard of mud at the bottom of the water and agreed to go find some. Loon dove first, but the distance was far too great, and after a while, he surfaced with nothing to show for his efforts. One by one, the other animals offered to help: otter, beaver, sturgeon, but the depth, the darkness, and the pressures were too great for even the strongest of swimmers. They returned gasping for air with their heads ringing. Some did not return at all. Soon, only little Muskrat was left, the weakest diver of them all. He volunteered to go while the others looked on doubtfully. His small legs flailed as he worked his way downward, and he was gone a very long time. They waited and waited for him to return, fearing the worst for their relative. And before long, a stream of bubbles rose with the small, limp body of the muskrat. He had given his life to aid this helpless human. But then the others noticed that his paw was tightly clenched, and when they opened it, there was a small handful of mud. Turtle said, "Here, put it on my back and I will hold it." Sky Woman bent and spread the mud with her hands across the shell of the turtle. She was moved by the extraordinary gifts of the animals, and she sang in thanksgiving and began to dance, her feet caressing the earth. The land grew and grew as she danced her thanks, from the dab of mud on Turtle's back until the whole earth was made, not by Sky Woman alone, but from the alchemy of all of the animals' gifts coupled with her deep gratitude. Together, they formed what we know today as Turtle Island, our home. Like any good guest, Sky Woman had not come empty-handed. The bundle was still clutched in her hand, and when she toppled from the hole in the sky world, she had reached out to grab onto the tree of life that grew there. In her grasp, there were branches, fruits, and seeds of all kinds of plants. These she scattered onto the new ground and carefully tended each one until the world turned from brown to green. Sunlight streamed through the hole from the sky world, allowing the seeds to flourish. Wild grasses, flowers, trees, and medicines spread everywhere. And now that the animals too had plenty to eat, many came to live with her on Turtle Island. It's really, really important to center this type of Indigenous knowledge so that we can really get a better grasp of what land means in terms of worldview from an Indigenous context. A couple things to pull from this story, right? One thing that many elders talk about in relation to creation is that human beings are not the pinnacle of creation, that human beings are often referred to as the younger brothers of creation. And what we can see here is that Sky Woman, right? And Dr. Kimmerer actually kind of characterizes Sky Woman as this helpless human, right? So reliant upon the elements, so reliant upon the animals who helped her, who literally broke her fall from the sky world. And so what we learn here, right, is that we are so interdependent upon all of these other beings, right? And really centering that idea that land and the beings that live on land are so much more than resources, right? Or there for resource development, but rather we are there in relationship, right, with these other beings, with the land, with the water. Next, we want to talk about Indigenous communities and nations pre-contact. So here we're talking about before the arrival of Europeans or settler nations. Something that's really important to note relation to this map that we have on the screen here from Nativedashland.ca is you can see that there's a lot of overlap, right? You can see that some of these colors are overlaying on top of some of these other colors, which are kind of labeled here with different nations and communities. We are taught that borders are colonial concept and that many nations and or communities were actually nomadic and so would move from season to season and actually go and enter into relationship or a treaty with other nations or communities when they would travel to a new location. And they would determine how it is they were going to live together in a harmonious way, in a respectful way, while still having maybe different languages, different hunting practices, different beliefs, different governance systems, but still finding a way to coincide and live together and take care of the land and the waters and those other beings on the territory in a good way. So on the topic of treaties, and we're not going to get too deep into treaties, that will be for another conversation, but just a few notes here that treaties are the original relationships and the original laws and commitments, agreements of the lands that we live on, we work on, and we play on now in the modern context. Right. Obviously, we have, federal law. In some cases, we may have territorial or provincial law or municipal laws and bylaws. And if we were to peel all of those different types of laws back, there are treaties that govern the territories that we are on. Okay. And these are not treaties that, expired when Canada became Canada in 1867, but rather these are agreements that have largely, in many cases, been ignored and have been trampled over by colonial law. Right? A few points here about treaties. Treaties were not introduced at point of contact. Treaties are something that Indigenous peoples, as I stated previously, were practicing and were coming to agreements around prior to contact, right? If a community or a nation were to move to a different territory just for better hunting experiences or hunting practices or seasonally, they may be entering into treaties with those neighboring nations or communities, right? Treaties are fundamentally are relationships and are proof of relationship. Now, what we see on the screen here on the left side is actually a replica of the two-row wampum belt, which is surrounding the two-row treaty that was negotiated between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch, okay, back in the 1400s. Now, treaties are also proof that the first settlers negotiated with Indigenous nations and communities on a nation-to-nation basis. So something that's so important that we really want to underscore here is that when we use the terminology Indigenous peoples, that we're actually talking about over 500 distinct nations, right? Indigenous peoples is not this big conglomerate, right? That where it's everyone speaks the same language, everyone has the same belief, everyone has the same histories. It is far more complex than that, okay? And so what's really important to note here is that when we use this kind of a totalizing terminology such as Indigenous peoples, or we say First Nations, that there's actually so many distinct communities and nations that are nested under those terms, and we really, really need to be cognizant of that, right? These treaties had no expiry date, so these treaties are still active, still living today in the modern sense, okay? These treaties are legally binding agreements. And again, I had spoken about a moment ago that these have been, trampled over by colonial law in many ways, okay? When thinking about how we conduct ourselves while living, working, and playing on these lands, let's think about how do we operate from a lens of treaty responsibility, right? How do we learn about what is in those original treaties that were negotiated in terms of, okay, well, how is it that we share the land? How is it that we share and take care of the water? How is it that we share and take care of the animals that live here and coexist with us, right? Learning about those different agreements and those original relationships gives us insight into how the original peoples of these territories conducted themselves. And that should give us and signal to us ways in which that we should conduct ourselves while on these territories. Let us lean into fulfilling treaty responsibility versus, thinking about, wanting to get involved in reconciliation from a lens of saviorism, right? Thinking about, Indigenous nations or communities from a deficit mindset. We need to move away from that, right? Because in that, we are thinking of Indigenous peoples as lesser, as subhuman, which has so many historical colonial roots that we want to move away from, that we don't want to return to. So let us lean into the lens of treaty responsibility. Moving forward here, so another point on how land is viewed. So this is actually a quote that is coming from Dr. Susan Hill, who is Mohawk from Six Nations of the Grand River Territory, and her text, "The Clay We Are Made Of." And in this text, I quote her here, "In English, we say, 'It belongs to me.' But in Ongwehoe Neha, or Haudenosaunee languages, we are really saying, 'I have a relationship with it.'" So what she's referencing here is that in English, we may say that this land belongs to me. I own this land, right? But in Ongwehoe Neha, or in Haudenosaunee languages, the closest we can get to that translation is saying, "I have a relationship with it," right? And I think something that's so interesting, and I'm really fascinated by this concept, is that when we speak traditional languages, right? And they may be traditional Indigenous languages or traditional, kind of other languages from other parts of the world, we are able to see the world through the eyes of our ancestors. And so from this, what we learned from our ancestors is that we could not say that this land belongs to us. That was a foreign understanding, a foreign concept. The closest thing we could get to saying is, I have a relationship with this land. I have a responsibility to this land. And I think that's such a key understanding when thinking about how land is viewed from an Indigenous context. So now let's jump into the whole kind of process around developing land acknowledgements. And here are some considerations, or some questions that we should ask ourselves before even jumping into developing a land acknowledgement. One, why am I doing a land acknowledgement, right? Is it to check a box? Is it to build better relationships with Indigenous communities? Is it to call others into action? What's the reasoning there? Two, what do I hope others will do as a result of hearing the land acknowledgement? Okay. Lastly, what impact do I hope to have? Okay. These are three considerations that are really important for us to kind of stew over and think about before jumping into the development of a land acknowledgement. So jumping into developing a land acknowledgement, we have 4 steps here in a process for you all, which we're so delighted to share today. 1, identify. 2, develop. 3, deliver. And 4, go beyond. That 4th point of go beyond is going to be so important, because we want to not just sit in a land acknowledgement and say, okay, we've done our work, let's kind of clean our hands of it. But how do we actually make meaningful change and step into meaningful action? So step 1, identify. Here are a series of questions for you to think about when working to identify the traditional territory that you may be on. Okay? 1, what is the history of the territory you live on? And how do you benefit from that history? 2, who are the traditional caretakers of the territory? 3, what do or did they call themselves? And we have kind of a do/did there, because in some cases, there may have been nations that were completely eradicated by colonialism and by violence, but in many cases, those people are still here today. Okay. 4, how did you come to be here? What is your journey, your family's journey to coming to these lands? 5, what is your relationship to this territory? And lastly, what are the impacts of colonialism here? Now, something that's important is, you're not going to go through all of these questions and answer all of them and put all of them into your land acknowledgement. It's more so an awareness piece. Let's identify, let's become familiar with the history of the territory that we are on. Next, we will move to develop. Okay, some points here that are really important around developing a land acknowledgement. 1, including your own identity, your name, your nationhood, where your ancestors came from. So very similar to how I even opened this session, I introduced myself in my Mohawk language, and then I also stated it in English. I named that I was from Mohawk and Anishinaabe nations, and that I was from 6 nations of the Grand River Territory. So obviously, if you are someone who is, non-Indigenous to these lands, that's going to look and sound a little bit different, but still very, very important to locate yourself and name your positionality. Another point in develop is to name the Indigenous nations whose territories you are situated on. Okay, and in some cases, it may be one nation. In other cases, it may be more than one. It may be more than one nation or community. And something I would say here that's really, really important is to do your homework around pronunciation. So I'll tell a kind of a very short tidbit here. Is I was actually delivering a session or a keynote at a conference not too long ago. And I was not responsible for doing the land acknowledgement. The organization was responsible for doing the land acknowledgement. And they actually checked in with me and sent me a request to have a quick meeting, because they wanted to practice the pronunciation with me and ensure that it was correct. when they were naming Haudenosaunee specifically. And I just found that to be so respectful, so validating, that someone took the time and said, I really want to make sure I get this right. I really want to ensure that I am being respectful and I'm representing our organization in a really great way when paying homage to this Indigenous confederacy or nation specifically. So if you're unsure about the pronunciation, right, do some homework. Sometimes I, even as an Indigenous person, have done that homework, and I've gone onto TED Talks or YouTube and looked up speakers from those nations to hear them name or go through the pronunciation themselves. Okay. 3, name the treaties that govern the territory. So there is always an opportunity also to do some further homework or further research on those original agreements that govern the territory by which you are offering a land acknowledgement for. Next, make it personal. And this is, I think, a place where you can be so creative, where you can really call on folks to step in and do the same. And it may look like one of these 4 things, and it actually goes beyond this list as well. These are just some ideas that we bring to you. 1, to share your own reflection about the history of Canada as it relates to Indigenous peoples, right? Where are you at? What are you thinking about? What is something maybe you've seen on the news recently that really struck you? And share that reflection with people in your land acknowledgement. Another idea might be to share a book that you're reading by an Indigenous author, right? You might say, oh, I'm reading Braiding Sweetgrass, right? And there's this part that has just really floored me, or this part that has been just so impressive or has opened my mind up to this idea, right? And I encourage other people to really work on indigenizing their library at home. Another idea is to share a quote that has resonated with you, right? And that may be a quote from a book. It may be a quote from an interview that you've heard. It may be a quote from a song or a poem written by an Indigenous person. Next, share an anecdote or memory, giving thanks to the land. So you may think about yourself in your younger days, playing or interacting with the land and giving thanks to all of that comfort that land brought you. Okay. And lastly is to call on others to do the same, right? Call on others to step into their reconciliation journeys by engaging in these types of actions. I think something that's so important here is oftentimes when we talk about reconciliation, people may jump to thinking about massive change or massive reconciliation, such as policy change, systemic change, procedure change, which are all really, really important, and which are things that I would refer to as like macro reconciliation. And I actually think it's so important for us to really highlight and spotlight these smaller movements of reconciliation, these micro acts of reconciliation, because it's showing that we can all have a place within this reconciliation journey, and we all have an entry point to be able to engage in this work together. So I offer a resource here for folks to be able to start working on their personal land acknowledgements. We know that, today by connecting in a virtual nature, and in many ways, many folks are still connecting in a virtual nature or professionally, or if you're doing your own learning. Native-land.ca is a great resource to be able to start your learning journey. So on native-land.ca, there's actually this really cool opportunity in these toggles up here where you're able to learn about territories, languages, treaties, right? So if I were to type in, let's say, Mississauga, Ontario, Canada, it's going to zoom me in. I can see a list of nations down here that I can learn about that were traditional stewards of these lands of Mississauga. I can actually turn on the languages toggle here, as well as the treaties toggle, and more information will populate here on this map. So something I'll say here is that this is largely crowdsourced, so it is always in development. So it is imperfect, but I think such a really amazing resource to be able to start your learning journey. So lastly, some points on delivering a land acknowledgement. Offer to deliver your personal land acknowledgement rather than reading a pre-written script in your organization. So we know that many organizations, places of work, schools have taken on the practice of developing a organization or school-wide land acknowledgement that may be nested on their website. And while that is all well and great, how can we use that as a jumping off point to then further develop your own personal land acknowledgement, right? We're really talking about when you're delivering a land acknowledgement to make it personal and meaningful to your own lived experience, right? If we are just simply reading a pre-written script, we are reading someone else's thoughts, someone else's considerations, when we really want to think about our own identities and positionalities as it relates to the land that we are on. Okay. And lastly, and I know I said this earlier, but I'm going to state it again, to really check on the pronunciation of the Indigenous nations or communities that you will be naming. I can't really underscore this enough. Really important to ensure that we're being so respectful in terms of naming those nations or communities. Okay. And lastly, a point here about going beyond. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but some ideas behind how we can go beyond in our land acknowledgements, to build relationships with Native and Indigenous peoples and in your community. A really great place to learn about Indigenous peoples is a local friendship center. So I really encourage folks to reach out and to learn how you can support, how you can attend and learn more through friendship centers. Next, to include Native and Indigenous people in discussions about race and equity. I've seen some really amazing things happen at different organizations where folks have started councils of elders and youth, elder advisory boards to really ensure that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous worldview is being respected and incorporated in the fiber and the work of an organization. Next, to educate yourself about the contemporary issues that are impacting Native and Indigenous peoples. So while the news may be a really common place for you to go and check out and see what's going on with Indigenous peoples in Canada, I really encourage folks to think about, well, what perspective is being centered there, right? Perhaps turning to Aboriginal People's Television Network, APTN, and watching the news from that perspective may be something that's really interesting. Checking out a First Nations or Indigenous news outlet online, and there are several that you could learn from, Windspeaker being one of them, Turtle Island News being another one, to learn from an Indigenous context about those issues that are impacting Indigenous peoples. Next, to learn about the strengths, achievements, and accomplishments of Native and Indigenous people and communities. Can't stress this enough. And it's really similar to a point earlier about stepping away from that deficit mindset, right? So how do we really center Indigenous genius, Indigenous strength, Indigenous greatness, right? And step away from this context or this framing of Indigenous peoples as being lesser, right? How do we really celebrate all of the goodness that comes from being Indigenous? Because as an Indigenous woman myself, I can tell you there is so many amazing things about coming from this community, coming from my nation, and how do we center that and make that a part of the conversation as well?
So I also want to share with you the importance behind having genuine relationships with Indigenous peoples when asking them for assistance with a land acknowledgement or taking on the role of doing a land acknowledgement yourself. So I am someone who, during my academic experience or during my academic journey, was asked to deliver a land acknowledgement for a university that I attended. And I was really excited to do this, as It was at an event that was about diversity, inclusion, and equity. And I can remember the day like it was yesterday. I walked into this giant auditorium. The dean of the school is there, and I have my, kind of name printed out on a placard and posted in one of the front row seats of the auditorium. And so I'm feeling really, really special and really important as I walk into this auditorium. And I take my seat, and I remember one of the organizers walking over to me and thanking me and saying how excited she was for me to be delivering the land acknowledgement today. And then she handed me a piece of paper, and I looked down at the paper, kind of assuming it's just the agenda for the event and how everything is going to flow. But instead, it was the university scripted land acknowledgement. And what they were envisioning that I would do was going to be reading directly from the script. And where this became problematic for me is knowing that my personal experience, my knowledge, any wisdom that I carried was not going to be represented in that script. And land acknowledgements, as we've been saying, throughout this learning module, are personal, right? And need to be personal and about your own reflections and your own journey, right? Someone else did that work to put it and make that script come together. Who knows? It might have been multiple people that put that together, but that was not my experience and was not my journey. And so in that exchange, it very much felt as if I was going to be the Indigenous person up there delivering this land acknowledgement that had been packaged and put together by someone else, which didn't feel authentic, didn't feel genuine, and was not honoring what I brought to the table or my own journey. So that is just some kind of a story or background to really illustrate the importance of being genuine and being authentic, and allowing Indigenous peoples, to tell their own story, and from a non-Indigenous perspective, stepping into that role of telling your own story and journey when it comes to land acknowledgements as well.
Okay. So now it's your turn. I really turn it over to you to jump into some practice, to head to native-land.ca as a resource, and there are plenty of other resources as well to check out, to actually start going through those 4 steps, right? Of identify, of develop, right? Of deliver, and of going beyond. I really, really encourage you all to now jump into the work, roll up your sleeves and give it a go, give it a try yourselves. Really want to say nyawa, thank you, miigwech, to you all for tuning in, for being on this learning journey with us today, as well as Canadian Race Relations Foundation for really hosting the space for this important conversation. And we'll be back in a short couple of months with a new installment in this web series. So again, my name is Heather Watts. I'm from First Peoples Group and Nyawa, and thank you very much. Goodbye.